Not all games have a story. Some are abstract and don't require any story at all, while other games have little or no story, simply because the designers decided the game didn't need any. Some will argue, however, that games are generally more powerful when they include the elements of a good story, along with, of course, good gameplay. Today we'll look at some of these elements that make for a good story, and hopefully in the end, make for a more compelling game. My name is Ryan Wienko, and this is Industry Broadcast. Dive into Storytelling 101, I want to send a big thank you out to David Perry for making today's article possible. All material in today's article, as well as future ones, are selections and condensed tidbits from David's new book titled David Perry on Game Design, A Brainstorming Toolbox. Published by our good friends over at PTR Course Technology, and links to purchase the book can be found on industrybroadcast.com, and for more information on David Perry, you can find that by going to dperry.com. Chapter 9. Storytelling Techniques. In the early days of the genre, first-person shooters had minimal stories. Games such as Doom and Quake didn't require much to get you to pull the trigger, but later games such as Half-Life and the Halo series had begun to rely heavily on strong story elements to complement the strong gameplay. Even real-time strategy games, which rarely had a lot of storyline, now often include an unfolding fiction to accompany the frenetic building, researching, exploring, and fighting, which you can see in a game such as Warcraft 3. Still others, such as Deus Ex, contain far deeper stories with more subtlety and range. Moreover, because games are often non-linear, stories may not unfold in the neat three-act structures almost universally seen in movies or television. Where stories exist, they must have the flexibility to allow for variation in the way they unfold, simultaneously allowing the player to determine the hero's path to as great a degree as possible. Arguably, the best game stories are emergent stories, meaning they are not fixed storylines, but stories that result from gameplay and player actions. In fact, in games such as those featuring massively multiplayer persistent worlds, the main story of the game is secondary to the individual experience of each player. In this way, each player creates his own story, while the larger story of the persistent world plays out around him. The individual's part in determining that story is generally minimal, but in each player's mind and experience, it is paramount. However, the underlying story of the world itself and its lore still plays an important role in the success of MMORPGs such as EverQuest and World of Warcraft. Considerable time and effort go into creating stories, both fundamental backstories and ongoing stories through quests and character interactions, for many massive multiplayer games. Joseph Campbell meets Star Wars and The Matrix. If you've ever wondered where good stories come from, one place to start is Joseph Campbell's seminal book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Joseph Campbell examines stories and myths from many cultures and times in history, coming up with a short blueprint of what he calls the hero's journey. Although this is not the only way to look at stories, it has been used by many successful modern storytellers as a guide, so I suggest that you consider it. In its simplest form, the hero's journey is summarized as a rite of passage represented in three basic stages: separation, initiation, and return. In Campbell's words, a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. This simplistic synopsis forms the basis for many stories, fables, and myths. It can be seen reoccurring through many cultures, and even modeled in the biographies of many famous and accomplished men and women. One simple example that illustrates this story admirably is the well-known series of images taken from Zen Buddhism, sometimes called the 10 Bowls. The hero of this simple story undergoes an allegorical journey, outward seeking a bull, or sometimes an ox, in the wilderness, but inwardly finding his own inner truth. These 10 stages are, in my words, the search. This is the normal wandering search for all people of truth, and is represented in this case by the elusive bull. The seeker is an ordinary man. Followed by discovering the footprints. This is the first sign that leads the seeker to what he seeks. It is evidence that the bull exists and is nearby. The third is the first sight. With all of his senses alert, the seeker catches his first glimpse of the bull. He sees the truth that he seeks for the first time, but it is only a glimpse to inspire his going further into the initiation that Campbell mentions. Fourth being the capture. The seeker catches up with a bull, and after some struggle manages to capture it. After his first glimpse, he must stay focused upon the bull in order to catch it. Taming. Even captured, the bull is wild and willful. The seeker must use discipline, intuition, and resolve to bring the wild beast under control. But once he has achieved this task, the bull becomes docile and does the seeker's bidding. Now he has found truth, and it follows his path. 6. Riding upon its back. In this stage, the seeker no longer walks with the bull behind him, but rides upon its back. He is at home with his truth and easily continues on his life's path. In many pictures, the seeker is playing a flute while riding the bull. To me, this is an image of contentment and repose, as well as communication with others that the truth has been found. 7. Transcendence. The seeker returns home. The bull is known as a transitory aspect of life. The seeker is at home, at peace, and no longer attached to the duality of truth or non-truth, bull or non-bull. 8. Emptiness. At last free of duality, the seeker transcends seeking, the bull, home, and even self. This image is generally depicted as a blank circle. 9. The source. From emptiness, the seeker now connects with the source of all knowledge and knowing. He perceives truth and existence without illusion, masks, or interpretation. This depiction as a beautiful garden with plants is symbolic of the desirable traits of the enlightened seeker. And finally, the world. Having completed his journey, the seeker returns to the everyday world, but now with a great boon to offer all of those who encounter him. He lives as an ordinary man, doing ordinary things, but those who encounter him receive enlightenment from his presence. In the 10 Bulls, the seeker goes from the ordinary world of seeking through the initiation and back to the ordinary world. He is changed, however, and brings back something from his journey, a gift for all to share if they will. In this sense, the seeker is much like a great many mythical heroes, even though this series of images represents a personal allegory and a spiritual journey. On some level, so do all heroes' journeys, myths, and fables. Story and the player's character. Linear stories work in movies and literature, and some elements of good linear stories can certainly be applied to games. However, it wouldn't be fun to play a character, even a great character, from literature if all you do is exactly what the character did in the original story. If the player has no choice at all, it's not really a game. That's not to say that literature hasn't contributed to a great many game plots, or that you have to change all of the overall story arc to adapt literature to games. But players must be able to make choices, and ideally even deviate from the story in some works in order for the games to feel alive. Good games allow players to test all paths, to discover the ones that work best for them, and also the ones that lead to failure. In games, as in real life, failure is often a great opportunity to learn, and can even be cool to experience depending on the game. So when adapting another source, it's often best to use a more open approach to the story's world, not the strictly linear storyline. In games, the world the character inhabits should be alive and somewhat unpredictable. Players should have the ability to choose their directions, and the world around them should respond. In place of simple, repetitive, and predictable scenes, such as characters who always do and say the same thing every time a player's character interacts with them, consider creating game situations in which things might change. People's attitudes should change based on circumstances or based on the player's previous actions. Some characters might have a past history with the player's character, which should affect their behavior and make it less predictable but more consistent with the player's experience. One other way to create more interesting game worlds is to create a responsive game system in which players may take different approaches and ultimately experience different events and outcomes based on those approaches. Story visualization and structure in games. Although many of the ideas contained in this chapter are applicable to games, they trace their origins to linear storytelling. Although linear methods are helpful and often useful when designing games, they cannot encompass the wide range of possibilities that are available for designers of games with their myriad of interactive possibilities. For games, new paradigms are inevitable, and new approaches to the art of story are almost mandatory. These new approaches will most likely borrow heavily from linear approaches, but will expand to make the best and most creative use of non-linear or interactive entertainment. Even in more or less linear plots, adding an element of freedom can give players a more rewarding experience. For instance, even if quests, missions, and tasks the player must perform to succeed in the game are essentially linear, if players can approach these tasks in different ways or different orders, or if they can engage in other interesting activities while completing these tasks, the game won't feel linear and limiting. Even in games such as Halo and Halo 2, in which your objectives are pretty linear, there are many tactical options, multiplayer options, and even different paths to get to your goals. Probably the least inspiring example of linear games design involves rail games, and games in which the path is present and offers no branches or options. You must tread a predefined path towards the goal, and no deviation or variation is offered. Even if you see a door that goes somewhere else, it will be locked. Personally, I find these games generally unsatisfying, although some arcade games essentially do this, but with enough non-stop action that all you really care about is surviving the current level, and with enough tactical options and power-up items to keep things interesting. I should note that just adding more choices, options, or rooms doesn't necessarily make a better game. It is always a balance that must be struck between playability and accessibility on one hand, and freedom, variety, and interesting choices on the other. But an excessively confining and limiting game is probably going to be poorly received. By contrast, many popular games have a plethora of choices and options, and by setting appropriate limits and structures, they still manage to be fun to play. In thinking about storytelling in non-linear media, I've thought in terms of metaphors and systems. I really don't think that it's very useful to dwell on theoretical models for too long, but for some of these ideas it might be useful in brainstorming and in considering new ways to structure games. For instance, working with 3D webs, snowflakes, or cubic spaces might not really mean much in the reality of designing a game, but they might inspire some new approaches, resulting in more original and unusual game designs. Snowflake, 2D or 3D. The suggestion of a snowflake model is only to inspire you to think in new ways about structure. To my knowledge, there is no current snowflake model of design. However, that doesn't mean that you can't use it to inspire some new sort of structure, and that's why it's here in this book, to inspire you. This purely theoretical concept of a snowflake structure is a more freedom variant of the web structure. Because no two snowflakes are alike, presumably no two snowflake game structures would be exactly the same either. I visualize this as a series of snowflakes set side to side and laid out in planes, like the web system. The difference is that instead of branching paths, as you have with the web, you have free-form movement within each of the snowflake domains, with the center of each snowflake providing the transition point to another plane of the story and game. The only significant difference between the web and the snowflake system is that the former is based on somewhat more of a specific story game action branching, and the snowflake is based on free-form movement and exploration. Does the snowflake metaphor work? Well, that's up to you. I only include it as a possible source of inspiration. When I think about webs, snowflakes, and other structural metaphors, my goal is to use these to imagine more interesting and diverse gameplay opportunities, not bind myself to some theoretical model. These ideas should be expansive, not contractive. So I put it to you. Can you imagine a snowflake model that can make your game more interesting and more fun? Cubes. The cubic model is somewhat difficult to understand. It is more or less a big empty box into which you dump elements of the game and story. There is no implied or underlining structure here, only a three-dimensional space in which to create. However, within each empty cube are the elements of game exploration and play, and each cube then connects to other cubes that are equally open-ended in structure. Cubes can be connected at any interface, either by seamless migration from cube to cube, or by means of structural connectors. For instance, consider a series of cubes connected by short tubular connected structures. These connectors would in fact be story transitions or markers. They would represent specific events or situations that the player would experience once they have satisfied the conditions of entry into the connector. This would then lead them into the next cube. The cube model might also include areas of web or snowflake design, so that your players would migrate between completely open areas and areas restricted by branching paths or some other type of experience. In some ways, Grand Theft Auto 3 and later games might fit into this model, because they provide nearly unlimited freedom within a zone, but require the accomplishment of certain prerequisites to gain access to new territories. In a different way, so could the products such as SimCity or The Sims, in which the game is a virtual sandbox for players to explore and create their own goals. However, this might also be better modeled by an empty sandbox approach. Although this is purely theoretical, this cubic structure implies that elements of the game are entirely freeform, and that the player has no restrictions within one of the cubes. Although this may not be very satisfying as a structural model, since it fails to define choice points for the player, other than that of the nodes and interfaces between the cubes, it might inspire some new way of conceptualizing gameplay. By offering players essentially a blank canvas in which to immerse themselves with transitional pathways to other blank canvases, or even to more traditional game structures, what kind of gameplay experience might emerge? How do you create a blank canvas of the cubic structure? This is why the GTA series has been so successful. In each game, you get more and more freedom, and more things you can do. You can, to date, fly a plane, drive a car, go into a building, kill people, whatever you like. Empty box with toys, sandbox. The empty box with toys or sandbox approach is for construction-type games and sim games, such as SimCity, in which you give players lots of elements, set properties, rules of interaction, and behaviors for these objects, and let the players just go for it. This doesn't really describe a story-based structure, for the most part, but stories could emerge from the interaction of elements within the game, as they do within The Sims. The emergent stories are essentially created in the minds of the players themselves, but in this sort of environment, each player conceives an individual story based on the experiences that he or she has. But of course, with clever and carefully controlled types of tools available, the kind and quality of the experiences can be to some extent predetermined. For instance, it's obvious that many players of The Sims will have a romantic adventure. What makes it obvious is the combination of knowing human nature and providing the appropriate game elements to allow that kind of story to emerge. Of course, there are other examples of sandbox games. Can you think of a few? And what makes them sandbox games? Emergent behavior. Many games exhibit the phenomenon of emergent behavior, in which the interaction of various elements can produce unexpected, unplanned, or unanticipated results or behaviors. The previous example of The Sims describes this sort of phenomenon to some extent. In essence, most massively multiplayer games rely on the emergent behavior of thousands of people to create the essence of gameplay. The structures, rules, and setting of the game are provided, but the players create much of the emergent stories, from ad hoc teaming, organized guilds, and affinity groups, and other various human-to-human interactions, to commerce systems, thievery, exploits, and cheats, and so on. Each player in a massively multiplayer game is the author of an individual story that is told only in his or her mind, but has the added effect of influencing the stories of all of the other players with whom he interacts. Even games that are for single players or for a small number of players can have emergent stories and behaviors. The more complex the system you create, the more likelihood there will be for emergent behaviors. If you create a virtual living world with many elements interacting according to determined rules, you are likely to see emergent behaviors. The question is, are they behaviors that you want, or are they going to detract from the game? One challenge is to create games in which there are a lot of emergent behaviors, and it is those very behaviors that make the game unique. This works because sometimes the things that happen are more interesting to the gamer who made them happen than something that we might think of for the player at a design meeting. Players don't even mind if this becomes hard work for them. For example, they might find that if an exploding barrel triggers the one beside it to explode, they might go and collect every barrel in the game and try to lay out a long fuse of them to go and blow up something else that the designers had never planned to be blown up. Using elements of the game world to achieve unlikely results can become a focus in itself, and many players end up getting very skilled at exactly this. Often emergent behaviors can result from very simple systems when they interact with multiple instances of the same system, or with other simple systems. One example occurs when Will Wright was designing ocean currents for Sim Earth. He used a very simple system of vectors, almost too simple to take seriously as a model for something as complex as ocean currents, and certainly not complex mathematical algorithms based on complex interactions in the oceans. And the simple system resulted in a remarkably realistic result. The emergent behavior of this simple system, when applied in the holistic environment Will had created, resulted in a very complex and satisfyingly realistic simulation. Plot twists. In many stories there are times when the hero discovers that whatever he thought was true is not, or the situation dramatically changes. There is one line in particular that comes to mind.
No, I am your father.
Often plot twists are major zingers that happen at the end of the story, such as in movies. The Unusual Suspects and The Sixth Sense are both examples of this. Other times, plot twists can be major events that weren't foreseen, but which dramatically change the events that follow and presumably the protagonist's actions. Now suppose that you didn't know the story of the Titanic. Talk about plot twists. The rich and successful are on the ultimate luxury cruise when it all turns to disaster. There must be a good story in there somewhere. Plot twists can happen at various points in a story. The term, "the plot thickens," usually refers to a moment when something new has been added to the story, making the situation more complex. This often involves a revelation or a discovery that significantly alters the course the protagonist must take. A good example is in The Maltese Falcon, when the ship's captain delivers the Black Bird to Sam Spade's office, putting him suddenly in possession of the item everybody's after. In games, plot twists are common. There are many opportunities within a game to provide information or situations that will alter the course of the game and consequently the direction the player must go in order to succeed. It's not uncommon to be playing a game and think that you're very close to the ending, only to discover that a whole new set of tasks is required before you reach that point. These tasks often come after you discover some new information about the nature of the final threat, or the solution to the big puzzle that you face. Note that plot twists, in the game sense, can be major shifts of the story or of the player's circumstances, or they can be minor temporary situations that simply require the player to adjust to circumstances. For instance, you step through a teleporter, and suddenly you find out that your squad members are actually enemies all along. They're just trying to get you to go through the portal, and now they are revealed. Unexpected? Yes. So what do? Assuming you somehow survive this encounter, the twisty part is over. The game has not substantially changed. This was a temporary change of circumstances. However, if you were to discover that the agency for whom you've been working actually represents the evil you thought you were fighting, as in Deus Ex, the twist substantially changes the rest of the game. Your goals just completely changed thanks to twist. Dilemmas. Many games involve a straightforward approach. Anything that moves is bad, shoot it. The story, if there is one, involves no complexity or ambiguity. The hero is in the right, and that's all you need to know. However, some games have attempted to create situations that present players with difficult choices, moral, ethical, or logical dilemmas. What is a dilemma? A dilemma is essentially a choice of actions, each of which has undesirable or imperfect consequences. For instance, the choice of whether to get burned from a fire when escaping a building through a corridor that's on fire, or to burn to death, is not really a dilemma, because the first solution is clearly good from the chooser's point of view, and the second choice is clearly bad. There's no ambiguity, and there's no difficulty in making the choice. But suppose that the choice was almost to be burnt alive, endure horrific pain for months, and live the rest of your life disfigured and grotesque to save 5 of your friends, or to endure minor burns but only save 3 of your friends. For some, this might be somewhat more difficult of a decision to make, because neither choice is perfectly desirable. A related dilemma would be a situation in which you had to choose who to save from the fire, assuming you can only save one person or thing: your wife, your baby, your father, your mother, your dog or cat, or your computer. You'd have to consider a rationale for your actions, given that only one could be saved. So, to a dilemma, a situation must have 2 or more choices, each of which is imperfect or has undesirable consequences, often the lesser of 2 or more evils. Dilemmas make great scenes for games and movies, because different gamers will have very different responses to such situations. Some will care only about themselves, and some will care about everybody but themselves. And that concludes yet another great article taken straight from David Perry's new book titled David Perry on Game Design, a Brainstorming Toolbox. A reminder that this is a very condensed selection from Chapter 9 of the book, 7 pages out of a total of 68. So we definitely recommend, if you want the full meat of the information provided here, you go out and purchase the book today. As always, the links to purchase the book can be found on Industry Broadcast, either by going to this post or by looking at the IB Book Club on the left-hand side of the page. My name is Ryan Wienko, as always signing off from IndustryBroadcast.com, doing my very best to bring the collective insight of the gaming industry to your ears.
Thank you.